The galaxy was vast, filled with countless species that all bowed to the power of the thrak dominion. These predators weren't just conquerors, they were destroyers, eradicating any force that dared resist their rule. Their fleets were an impenetrable wall of plasma-powered ships, and their ground forces unmatched. No one in their right mind would challenge them. They didn't need to negotiate or compromise. They simply took what they wanted and obliterated anything standing in their way. To the thrak, it was a natural order. They were the apex predators of the universe, and anything beneath them was either prey or inconsequential. Entire species had been wiped from existence, their names forgotten as the thrak marched forward, their empire expanding like an unstoppable wave. Their reputation spread far and wide. Those who dared fight back vanished without a trace. The thrak didn't just win battles, they annihilated their enemies so completely that no one would ever dare rise again. Their soldiers were bred for war, their technology centuries ahead of anything the galaxy had seen. There was no weapon powerful enough to break their shields, no fleet fast enough to escape their wrath. They lived by one rule: the strong survive, the weak perish. And yet there were whispers. Faint murmurs across distant sectors about a strange new force, something small, insignificant, but unsettling. A handful of ships that had appeared from nowhere, seemingly human in origin. The thrak barely took notice, dismissing them as primitive relics. After all, what threat could a species from an outlying planet pose to the most feared empire in the galaxy? The High Command met in their grand halls, discussing their next conquest with the usual confidence. Their tactical displays showed worlds ready to be harvested, resources to be claimed, and another weak species to bow to their rule. But something caught their eye on one of the maps, a single, unmarked ship, slowly moving through their territory, alone and unbothered by the might surrounding it. They laughed. A lone human ship wandering into thrak space. It was a joke. A ship without backup, without support, daring to cross into their realm. They wouldn't even bother sending an entire fleet. A single cruiser would be enough to crush it. They didn't need overwhelming force to deal with a species like humans. The decision was made without much thought. A cruiser was dispatched, its captain eager to claim what little glory could be salvaged from such an insignificant victory. They would make an example out of this human ship, let the galaxy know that no one, no matter how small, could enter thrak space without permission. As the cruiser approached the human ship, their scanners picked up little of interest. The ship appeared outdated, underpowered, almost laughable by thrak standards. Its weapons systems were practically non-existent, and its shields barely registered on their sensors. It was, by all accounts, a floating scrap of metal. The thrak captain opened a communication line, speaking in the usual tone reserved for inferior beings. "Human vessel, you have violated thrak space. Surrender immediately, and we may grant you a swift death." There was no immediate response from the human ship. The silence hung in the air, almost mocking, as the thrak crew smirked at each other. They'd seen this before: fear, hesitation. These humans didn't know what was coming. Then, finally, a response crackled through. It wasn't fear, nor was it panic. The voice was calm, measured, almost too calm for the situation. "We suggest you turn back. This space isn't yours to claim." Laughter erupted on the thrak cruiser. The audacity! Who did these humans think they were? Telling the thrak to turn back? It was almost endearing how these creatures clung to delusions of grandeur. The captain gave the order. "Fire!" The first volley of plasma bolts lit up the void, hurtling towards the human ship. It was supposed to be an execution, quick and final. But something strange happened, something that had never occurred in the history of thrak warfare. The human ship didn't flinch. Its shields didn't shatter, its hull didn't break apart. Instead, the plasma bolts seemed to slow as they approached, their energy dissipating into nothingness just before impact. It was as though the ship had absorbed the attack effortlessly. Confusion spread across the thrak bridge. This wasn't possible. No ship, no matter how advanced, could absorb their plasma fire without taking damage. The captain ordered a scan, but the readings came back jumbled, incomplete. It was as if the human ship's systems were too complex for their scanners to comprehend. Before they could react, the human ship moved, swiftly, almost too fast for the wild thrak to track. In a blink, it had repositioned itself behind the cruiser, its weapons systems now active. And what happened next would go down in history as the moment the wild thrak first felt fear. A single shot fired from the human ship, an energy pulse, small, almost insignificant compared to the massive plasma bolts the wild thrak wielded. But that single shot tore through the wild thrak cruiser's shields like they weren't even there, cutting through its hull with surgical precision. The cruiser erupted in flames, its systems failing instantly, and before the crew could understand what had happened, the ship was dead in the water. Panic spread across the wild thrak fleet as word of the human ship's victory reached them. How could a single ship, seemingly primitive, defeat one of their cruisers in a single shot? It didn't make sense. Their empire had faced down entire fleets without a scratch, and yet here they were, bested by a species they had dismissed as irrelevant. Whispers of the humans grew louder, but this time, they weren't just whispers. They were warnings. The human ship hovered silently in space, its movements deliberate and controlled. The wild thrak fleet had responded quickly after the destruction of the first cruiser, sending 2 more ships to handle what they still believed was a minor threat. They couldn't imagine that the humans could stand against them for long. As the 2 wild thrak cruisers approached, their captains exchanged confident, almost bored glances. They wouldn't make the same mistake twice. This time, they planned to overwhelm the human ship with sheer firepower, leaving nothing to chance. Their ships bristled with weapons, each primed to deliver a devastating barrage. A message was sent to the human ship, an ultimatum this time, stripped of the earlier mockery. Surrender now. You cannot win. The response came immediately, calm and unflinching. You're mistaken. We have no intention of losing. The wild thrak officers sneered at the audacity. Such confidence from a species so insignificant in the grand scheme of things. It didn't matter though. This would be over soon, and the humans would join the countless others who had been crushed beneath wild thrak rule. Orders were barked, and both cruisers prepared to unleash a storm of plasma and destruction. But before they could fire, the human ship acted first. It moved with an impossible speed, darting forward into the gap between the 2 cruisers. The wild thrak captains barely had time to react as the human vessel released a pulse of energy that rippled through the surrounding space. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The wild thrak ships, bristling with firepower, were suddenly silent. Their weapons, once menacing and ready to obliterate, now flickered uselessly. Confusion gripped the wild thrak commanders. Their sensors showed power fluctuations, but there was no indication of what had caused them. The human ship had done something that defied their understanding of warfare. While the wild thrak scrambled to regain control, the humans didn't hesitate. Their ship, still maneuvering with incredible precision, targeted one of the cruisers with deadly accuracy. A single beam of energy sliced through the cruiser's defenses, ripping into its core. The cruiser shuddered as explosions rocked its hull, and within moments, it was nothing but wreckage drifting in space. The second cruiser, still struggling with the strange power fluctuations, watched in horror as its sister ship was reduced to a smoldering heap. The wild thrak captain barked frantic orders, desperate to retaliate. But the human ship had already moved again, repositioning itself out of range of any potential counterattack. Panic set in. This wasn't how the wild thrak fought. They were the ones who overwhelmed their enemies, not the other way around. Their technology was superior. Their tactics were flawless. And yet, here they were, being outmaneuvered and outgunned by a single ship from a species they had deemed irrelevant. For the first time in their empire's history, the wild thrak felt the cold grip of fear. This wasn't a battle they could win through brute force alone. The humans weren't playing by the same rules, and that made them dangerous in ways the wild thrak had never considered. The remaining cruiser finally managed to regain partial control of its systems. Weapons came back online, though their targeting was erratic, and the captain ordered a desperate strike. Plasma bolts fired in rapid succession, filling the void with glowing energy. But once again, the human ship defied all expectations. It moved with a grace and speed that seemed impossible for its size, evading every shot with ease. The thrak captain clenched his jaw in frustration. How could this be happening? The humans weren't supposed to be capable of this. They weren't supposed to have technology that could rival the thrak fleet. But here they were, defying everything the thrak thought they knew about warfare. In a final act of desperation, the thrak cruiser attempted to ram the human ship, hoping to crush it through sheer size and mass. But the human vessel was already prepared. At the last possible moment, it released another pulse of energy, this one far more powerful than before. The wave rippled through the fabric of space, hitting the thrak cruiser with devastating force. The cruiser's shields crumbled, and its engines sputtered as the energy pulse overwhelmed every system on board. The ship began to drift, its power flickering out like a dying star. There was no time to react. The human ship unleashed a final, decisive strike. A beam of energy sliced through the thrak cruiser's hull, detonating its core. In seconds, the once mighty vessel was torn apart, its remains scattering across the darkness of space. The thrak were stunned. They had never encountered anything like this before, a force that could defeat them so effortlessly, so efficiently. The human ship didn't boast or gloat. It didn't linger to savor its victory. It simply completed its task and disappeared into the void, leaving the thrak to grapple with the implications of what had just happened. As the thrak officers began to regroup and assess the damage, one thing became abundantly clear: the humans weren't just another species to be conquered. They were a threat. A threat unlike anything the thrak had ever faced. The thrak High Command would hear of this. They would send more ships, more firepower. But deep down, in the quiet corners of their minds, a seed of doubt had been planted. The humans had done something no other species had ever managed. They had made the thrak question their invincibility. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. The thrak High Command could no longer ignore the threat. News of the destroyed cruisers spread faster than they could contain it, and what was once seen as a minor skirmish had now escalated into something much more dangerous. They were forced to admit that the humans, once dismissed as a backwater species, had capabilities that defied every assumption they had made. This was not a battle they could afford to lose. Not after centuries of dominance. A fleet was mobilized. Not just any fleet, but one led by their most experienced commanders, armed with the most advanced weaponry in their arsenal. The thrak were determined to crush this human threat before it spread any further. They viewed the humans as a virus, a dangerous anomaly that needed to be eradicated swiftly and brutally. As the fleet entered the system where the human ship was last seen, there was no sign of their target. The void stretched out before them, empty, save for the distant stars. The thrak commanders were cautious, their earlier arrogance now tempered by the knowledge that these humans were not to be underestimated. They deployed scouts, scanning every inch of space for any sign of the enemy. It didn't take long before they found it. A lone human ship, the same one that had destroyed their cruisers, appeared on their scanners. It was moving slowly, almost deliberately, as if waiting for them. The thrak fleet, now bolstered by their numbers and firepower, didn't hesitate. They closed in, surrounding the human vessel on all sides. There would be no escape this time. The thrak fleet commander opened a channel, his voice cold and commanding. "Human ship, you are outnumbered and outmatched. Surrender now, or face annihilation." The human response came, as always, calm and direct. "We suggest you reconsider. This will not end as you think." The fleet commander's patience was running thin. The humans had pushed them too far, and now it was time to show them the full might of the thrak. He ordered the fleet to fire in unison, unleashing a barrage of plasma and energy weapons that filled the void with light. The power of their combined firepower was enough to reduce entire planets to ash. But once again, the humans did not react as expected. The lone human ship moved, not with the frantic desperation of an overwhelmed foe, but with the precision and efficiency of a predator itself. It weaved through the storm of plasma fire, avoiding the attacks with an ease that left the thrak fleet stunned. Then, just as before, the human ship retaliated. This time, however, it was different. The energy pulse that had crippled their cruisers was not the only weapon in the human arsenal. From the belly of the human ship, new weapons emerged, projectiles that moved too fast for the thrak sensors to track. The first thrak ship in their formation was struck, and the results were catastrophic. The projectile didn't just penetrate the hull, it seemed to destabilize the very core of the ship, causing a chain reaction that ignited its fuel reserves. The explosion was so massive that it consumed 2 more ships in its wake, and the shockwave rippled through the fleet, throwing their formations into chaos. The thrak were now in a battle they didn't understand, facing weapons they had never seen before. The human ship was far more advanced than they had realized, and their standard tactics were proving useless. Every attempt to surround the human ship ended in failure, as it moved too quickly for them to pin down. Every volley of plasma fire was dodged or absorbed by the strange energy shields the humans seemed to wield effortlessly. Panic began to spread through the fleet. This wasn't just a ship they were facing, it was a weapon unlike anything the thrak had encountered. Their commanders shouted orders, trying to regroup, but the human ship continued to tear through their ranks with surgical precision. Each strike was deliberate, each move calculated, as if the humans had planned for this exact scenario. The thrak fleet, which had once been the hammer of their empire, was now being dismantled piece by piece. And the worst part was that the humans didn't seem to be expending any real effort. To the thrak, it felt as though they were being toyed with, their once mighty fleet turned into target practice. Amid the chaos, the fleet commander desperately tried to understand what had gone wrong. How had the humans become this powerful? How had they developed technology that outstripped the thrak's centuries of innovation? These questions haunted him as he watched ship after ship fall to the human assault. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the human ship stopped its attack. It hovered in the middle of the ruined fleet, untouched and unmoved. The thrak, what remained of them, hesitated, unsure of what would happen next. The human ship sent one final transmission, its message clear and chilling. "You were warned." With that, the human ship disappeared into the darkness of space, leaving behind nothing but wreckage and the shattered remnants of the once proud thrak fleet. The few thrak ships that survived limped back to their homeworld, carrying with them the news that the humans were not just a threat, they were a force that could not be stopped. The thrak High Command, for the first time in their long reign, found themselves facing an enemy they could not easily defeat. The humans had shown them the true meaning of power, and it was a lesson they would not soon forget. The remnants of the thrak fleet limped back to their home system, their ships battered and broken, their pride shattered. They had been invincible for so long that the concept of defeat was entirely foreign. Yet here they were, reeling from the loss of nearly half their fleet, at the hands of a single human ship. It was unthinkable, unimaginable, and now undeniable. In the vast halls of the thrak High Command, silence reigned. The news had arrived before the surviving ships had even returned. The humans, this small, insignificant species from a distant, unknown corner of the galaxy, had humiliated them in a way no enemy ever had. The ruling council sat in stunned disbelief as they reviewed the reports. Their fleets were supposed to be unmatched, their technology centuries ahead of any other species. And yet, the humans had defeated them with apparent ease, displaying weapons and tactics that the thrak had never even conceived of. There was a growing sense of unease, something unfamiliar to the thrak leadership. For the first time, they faced an enemy that they couldn't predict, couldn't understand. Every time they thought they had the humans cornered, they had been outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outwitted. This wasn't just a defeat, it was a revelation. The galaxy was no longer theirs for the taking. The High Command debated what to do next. Some called for immediate retaliation, the full force of the thrak Empire brought down upon the humans in an all-out war. But even those voices were hesitant now. What if the humans had more ships like the one that had decimated their fleet? What if the humans weren't as outnumbered as they had originally assumed? There were too many unknowns, and that terrified them. reports began to filter in from the outer territories. Word of the wild thrak defeat had spread faster than anyone anticipated. Other species, long oppressed by the wild thrak, had heard of the human victory, and whispers of rebellion were beginning to circulate. The wild thrak had always maintained their rule through fear, but now that fear was beginning to crack. If the humans could stand against the wild thrak and win, perhaps others could as well. And then came the most troubling reports of all, sightings of more human ships. Not just one or two, but entire fleets, moving through space with the same calm precision as the ship that had destroyed the wild thrak forces. The humans, it seemed, were not content with just one victory. They were making their presence known across the galaxy, and with each appearance, the legend of their power grew. The wild thrak couldn't ignore it any longer. They had assumed that humanity was a minor player in the grand scheme of galactic affairs, but now they realized how wrong they had been. Humanity wasn't a new species. They were a rising power, and one that had remained hidden until now. They had emerged from the shadows, armed with technology and strategies that the rest of the galaxy had never seen, and they were challenging the status quo. As more species took notice, alliances began to shift. Some looked to the humans with hope, seeing them as potential saviors from the wild thrak's iron grip. Others viewed them with fear, uncertain of what this new force would bring. But one thing was clear: the humans were no longer an unknown quantity. They were now a force to be reckoned with, and their influence was spreading faster than anyone could have predicted. The wild thrak, once the undisputed rulers of the galaxy, now found themselves on the defensive. Their fleets were being rebuilt, but it would take time they no longer had. The humans were advancing, and there was no telling when or where they would strike next. For the first time in their empire's long history, the wild thrak were afraid. And it wasn't just the wild thrak. Across the galaxy, species that had once been loyal to the wild thrak were beginning to question their allegiances. The humans had shown them that the wild thrak weren't invincible, that their reign could be challenged. It was a dangerous time, with rebellions brewing in every corner of the galaxy, and the humans at the center of it all. The humans didn't make any grand declarations, didn't broadcast their victories to the galaxy. They simply acted. Every time a wild thrak ship crossed their path, it was destroyed with the same cold efficiency that had defined their first encounter. Every battle was swift, every victory decisive. It wasn't long before the wild thrak leadership realized that they were not just fighting a species. They were facing an entirely new kind of warfare, one that they weren't prepared for. The galaxy was changing, and the wild thrak were powerless to stop it. Their fleets, once the terror of the stars, were now little more than targets for the human ships that seemed to appear out of nowhere, strike, and disappear just as quickly. The wild thrak's enemies were emboldened, their allies uncertain. Everything the wild thrak had built was beginning to crumble. In the midst of all this chaos, one fact stood out above all others: the humans had done what no other species had ever been able to do. They had made the wild thrak fear for their survival. They had turned the tables on the galaxy's most powerful empire, and they had done it without mercy, without hesitation. As the wild thrak High Command convened for yet another emergency meeting, the reality of their situation was becoming clear. They could no longer fight the humans the way they had fought every other species. They needed new strategies, new technologies, and perhaps, most of all, a new understanding of their place in the galaxy. Because now, the galaxy was no longer theirs alone. The humans had arrived, and with them came the end of the wild thrak's era of invincibility. What came next was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the wild thrak would never forget the humans, and neither would the galaxy.